Hi, welcome to the Chad Bozarth Show. Thanks for listening. Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, it's a privilege.
You know, you've been on my list for a while as someone I wanted to interview, and then I saw you post about your new podcast the other day. I said, okay, now's the time. I better reach out to Michael.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. It's always a good time.
Yeah. So tell me about your new podcast. It's called Deep Wells.
Yeah, so Deep Wells and kind of our tagline is ancient insights for enduring questions. And so tied into my interest, of course I'm an evangelist, and so I'm looking for ways to share the gospel with people that are relevant, but also I just have a deep fascination with history, especially Christian history. And so trying to tie those things together where we're looking at these enduring kind of existential questions that human beings have asked through the ages, and then some of the answers that have been proposed, and ultimately what Jesus Christ says about it.
Mm, that's so cool. Um, what would be uh what would, in your opinion, be the existential question that you think most people have, or in your experience?
Hmm. There's the major ones of, where did I come from? Why am I here? And where am I going? And I think really the overarching question that kind of encapsulates all of that is, what is the meaning of life? What is this whole thing about? Is this just an accident? Is this some capricious experiment of some, far off divine being that just thought he'd make us and see what happened? Or is there actually a God who is interested in my life, my situation, that's orchestrating things for my good, And so those are the big questions, but really I think it does all come down to purpose. And maybe that tells us a little bit about human nature, because it kind of does center on us to some degree, but maybe that's where we start. Maybe that's what gets us thinking about what's outside of ourselves.
Mm, that's good. What do you think? I was just watching a video of somebody last night, and he was talking about, everybody has presuppositions. What are your thoughts? I am no expert on apologetics by any means, but what are your thoughts on like presuppositional apologetics? Is that kind of the perspective that you come from, or do you come from a different perspective?
I'm not an expert on that either. Someone that knows better than I do could probably answer the question of what my, even to categorize myself. I'm not sure if I know enough to do that well, but um, I mean, yes, I think we do all deal with presuppositions, whether we realize it or not. Sometimes theology is thought of as kind of this arcane, impenetrable type of study that's so deep and maybe doesn't have a lot of application to everyday life. But the fact of the matter is, we all have a philosophy of life. We all have a theology, whether we realize it or not, whether we have assessed that in some way. And so we're all dealing with presuppositions. And the crazy thing about knowledge, when you get into epistemology, the limits of knowledge, how we attain knowledge, it really starts to get to where, you can't really know much of anything 100%. And I
Mm,
think in our age, people have somewhat given up on this idea. So, like in the Enlightenment era, you think of someone like Rene Descartes, and they would do these mental experiments where they would try to drill down to the, terra firma of epistemology. What can we really know? And there was this idea in this rationalistic worldview that if we just had greater knowledge, incrementally greater knowledge, that eventually we could get down to absolute truth,
mm,
that we could figure it out in our brains, that we could prove it empirically. And really, I think as that modern era faded, and really through, all the cataclysms of the 20th century, especially, morphed into what we call now postmodernism. I think a lot of people have somewhat given up on the idea that truth can be known exhaustively, or even whether truth exists at all, whether there's one single core of truth or whether there's just different perspectives and are all equally valid in some way. So I think it's an interesting question. I think if you had taken a survey of young people 200 years ago, I don't think any of them are still with us, but if you could have asked those people that lived through the Napoleonic Wars or whatever, I think that some of them really would have felt like, yeah, we're just on this upward trend as a human race, and we're just going to excel and we're going to reach our full potential. We're going to leave the shackles of the past behind. We're going to be our best self, to put it in a modern day slogan. And that experiment failed catastrophically. It was just a huge failure. And I think young people today especially are really skeptical about everything, things that were taken for granted, things that we thought were established. And it seems like the ground is shaking underneath us in so many ways. And so I think that the claims of Jesus Christ are just as valid and just as relevant as they've ever been.
Hmm, that's good. You know, to your point, sometimes I do get a little sad or depressed because, like, when you're growing up in school and you're just told, you read a history book and, you're just thinking, okay, this is just how it is, or this is how it was. And then as you get older, you realize, oh, that was written from a particular perspective. So
Mm-hmm.
there's definitely some facts in there, but they're from a whatever perspective that may be. And so it's like the older you get, what is there a proverb or is it in Ecclesiastes, with knowledge comes sadness or something like that. I just butchered
Mm-hmm.
that, but I feel that way sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean, things definitely have an interpretation, and the interpretation is often subliminal. It's just assumed until it gets challenged. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of, where the narrative, the meta narrative, that interpretation is being challenged. And a lot of that can be very valid. I think it's good to drill down on things and really assess things and never just you know, they say assumption is the lowest form of knowledge, and I think that can certainly be the case. So I encourage, I think about young people a lot. I've got two kids, one just graduated from college, one just graduated from high school. And so they're in that college and career kind of time. And they're both really interested in the big questions of life. And on a practical side, they're wanting to make a difference in the world. They're wanting their life to matter. They're wanting it to count, to add up to something. And I really think that that's something that God puts in the heart of young people as they look forward to their life, taking that long view. And so I think it's good for people to question. And frankly, it's not just for the young. I think it's good for all of us to assess things and find out, is this really the way things are? Is this really the perspective? I don't think it's ever attractive to just go along with the crowd just for the sake of popularity. I mean, if you look at history, that's not been a good indicator of truth or worth at all. So yeah, there's just a lot of questioning going on in people's hearts and lives, and I think that they're looking for that anchor, which of course, as a Christian, I believe that anchor, that rock, is Jesus Christ Himself.
Yeah, that's good. Well, let me ask you, speaking of, I guess, popular level perspective, um, I love Lucky Charms, and then other people love St. Patty's Day. Tell me about your book. I'll probably butcher the name, but is it Patricius?
Yeah, that's great. And actually,
Okay.
there's several, depending on where you learned Latin or if you learned Latin, there's several different ways that you can say it. So, I mean, Yeah, I would just say Patricius, and
Okay.
however it comes out is fine, definitely.
Well, I'm a Texan, so whatever. Patricia. Anyway,
Just think of it like Patricia with an S at the end.
okay,
That's how
that's
I
good.
think of it. Yeah, Patricius.
So this book is about Saint Patrick. Tell me about Saint Patrick. What do we get wrong? What do we get right? Um, my
Well,
knowledge
he's
is
a
so limited.
yeah, well, he's a just a fascinating person. Of course, a lot of us get our information about him from popular mythologies and what we'd call hagiography, these kind of myths that
Mm,
grow up around historical figures from the distant past. And he certainly is from the distant past. He would have been born right at the end of the fourth century. So just as the Roman Empire in the West had collapsed just about 14 years prior,
wow.
and when he was about 20, 15 to 20 years old was when, because of the attacks by the Goths in Rome, the Roman armies withdrew from Britannia. So he was born in modern day Great Britain, probably Wales on the western coast. And so he was raised in a Christian family, was kind of a rebellious teenager. And when he was 16 years old, as the Romans drew out and there was this power vacuum, there were a lot of marauding pirates in the region, and he was actually kidnapped in a pirate raid and taken from his family home, taken across the sea to Ireland, sold into slavery, and lived there for about 6 years. And it was really in that period of slavery and all the trauma. I mean, you can imagine, getting kidnapped and all that that would entail. He really he was working in very remote settings as a shepherd and would be out in the forests, out in the fields for long stretches of time, just out there in the elements, and really began to take inventory of his life and frankly really began to cry out to God from his heart and call on the God of his ancestors, his family. They were early Christians, and he really repented of some of the things he had been doing and began to pray and to seek after God. And in one of these moments, he hears, what so many of us have felt in different ways, that God was talking to him. And this voice that he heard in his heart was telling him that now it's the time to escape and escape to the coast. And so he did that, and he made his way, I think it was about 200 miles, and
Wow.
probably had people on his track the whole way, people trying to reclaim him and recapture him. And he made his way to the coast. I think that the captain of the ship that he was trying to board knew that something was up with his story and didn't want to get involved with this mess and refused to give him passage, but he prayed and God opened that door. And anyway, he ended up getting back to Britannia and then ultimately went on to study theology in Gaul, what would be France today. And probably, I don't know if he really had any intention of going back to Ireland. I mean, he kind of escaped, just in this last ditch effort to get out, and had every reason to not want to go back. And yet his heart was turned toward the Irish people. And one night he had a dream, and there was this Irish man standing on the coast, and he was calling out, and he said to him, "Come back to us, holy youth, holy young man," and basically tell us the way of salvation. And then around this man, this chorus of other voices kind of came out of the forest and was like calling him to come back. And so at that time he made that decision, and right around 432, if I'm not mistaken, was when he took a mission team, went back to Ireland, and the rest is history. Just a fascinating story. And so I thought this deserves to be, made into the drama that it is. I think it'd make it an awesome movie. Some movies have been made of it, but it's just got all the elements that you would want.
Wow. So your book is kind of like historical fiction, kind of?
Yeah, yeah. So what I did, I took the two extant writings that we have that most scholars believe are authentic, that they're actually from Patrick's hand. Patricius, by the way, is the Latin name that his family would have given him. It means nobleman, and Patrick,
Mm,
the kind of Gallicized, I guess, it's Irish form of his name that we
mm,
know him by. But he would have grown up being called Patricius. And
mm,
so he went back there with, all these intentions of changing the country, but he also knew the people in a way that very few did. He knew their culture. It seems like that there was this belief among the clergy at that time, because there were quite a few Christians in Britannia, but for them, the Wild West was Ireland, and there was this kind of idea that the Irish people were so brutal and so backward and so uneducated that they couldn't actually even understand the concepts of the gospel. And Patrick said,
mm,
no, I know these people. I know their life. I know their heart, their culture, their language. And so he was really, I think, the key strategic person that could actually convey the gospel to the Irish in a way that they could understand. And we all have reason to thank God. I mean, everybody knows if you've met an Irish person, they're the kindest and most hospitable people on the planet. But apparently back then they were pretty bloodthirsty. So we have St. Patrick to thank for civilizing the Irish a little bit and not giving up on them.
Well, I can't I've been to Northern Ireland, which I know that is not the same. Um and I remember I was telling some people the other day, in my family we're pretty sarcastic. We kind of show our love to each other by making fun of each other. And I remember being in Northern Ireland meeting this pastor, and I just met this guy, and he was just making fun of me to my face. Well, but like in a nice,
Yeah.
chummy way or whatever. But I mean, he was just letting it rip, and I'm like, okay, I wasn't sure what to do because I can get pretty sarcastic and something. I just met this guy. If I meet him at his level, I don't know that I feel comfortable doing that. Anyway, it was great. But yes, I love that experience. Again, I know that's different than Ireland, but well, that book sounds amazing. So I will have to, maybe I'll ask for that book for Christmas from my wife or something, because it
Yeah.
sounds awesome.
Just seed that little
Yeah,
idea. Just a minor suggestion.
yeah,
If
just
you're looking for the right
you
gift.
know, if you're looking for the right gift, this sounds amazing. Well, let me pivot a little bit. Michael, how many languages do you know?
Well, they're all at different levels, but spoken languages, of course, I grew up speaking English, but then French and Spanish. I started with French first in high school just because I was interested in it. And then when my wife and I knew that we were moving to Argentina, of course, where they speak Spanish, I pivoted to Spanish, and that quickly surpassed my French. So my French has never been as good in recent years as my Spanish, but I'm conversational in French and fluent in Spanish. And then there's scholarly languages, kind of academic languages that really aren't used in day-to-day speech that I have studied, like Biblical Hebrew, Koine Greek. And then right now I'm just for fun, I guess, just because I wanted to. I'm learning Latin. And so that's that one I thought would be easy with the French and the Spanish, and then even English. About 30% of our vocabulary has a Latin origin. And so I thought, well, wow, I've probably got a lot of the vocabulary already. I'll just have to learn the mechanics of the language, and I'll be cooking with Crisco. So that's what I'm doing. But I just love languages. I always have.
That is so interesting. I love languages too. I'm nothing like I can just I've tasted a little bit of different languages is how I like to put it. What is your approach to learning a foreign language? I suppose something like Spanish or French would be different than like Greek or Hebrew, but can you give me some insight on what is your approach? Once you make the determination, hey, I'm gonna jump in on this language, what is your process?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing you have to look at is motivation. People learn languages either because they want to or they have to, sometimes both. In
Mm,
my case with Spanish, it was both. I had to learn it and I also wanted to learn it. Sometimes, like with biblical Hebrew, I just had to learn it as part of my degree program, and eventually the want followed after that.
Mm.
So that's the thing. You have to have some internal motor, some compelling reason to learn a language. That really helps. And it can be just something as simple as, hey, I like the way Italian sounds. I want to learn
Mm.
Italian. It doesn't have to be some lofty, you don't have to know exactly what the utility of that is going to be. And I encourage people, don't worry, how am I going to use this language? If you find it interesting, it's just good for you. It's good for your brain. I mean, there's all kinds of studies coming out that show how useful it is for our physical brains, our minds, to learn languages. They say it's one of the most difficult things that an adult can actually attempt is to learn a foreign language. And it's like a triathlon for your brain, basically. Keeps your brain firing on all cylinders. There's even some studies coming out that seem to indicate that it can stave off the effects of dementia and Alzheimer's. I mean, there's just so many benefits for it. But as far as methodology, once you've made that decision that you want to learn a language and you've settled on one, I would focus on one at a time until you've
Mm.
kind of got it rolling, you've got some momentum. Don't try to learn three or four at the same time. Um, not at the beginning level, at least. Once you've made that decision, I think it's really a matter of just getting your toe in the pool, just dipping your toe in, like you're at the beach, and maybe you're thinking, well, I don't know how deep I want to go. Well, don't worry about that. Just get your feet wet, get in there, just get some exposure, make some friends, maybe watch a movie with subtitles in that language, anything you can do, and that's all going to accrue toward the learning of that language, and just get exposure to it. I think maybe the biggest hack, if you will, that has helped me is I find ways to build language learning and language acquisition into my daily life, into things that I'm already doing, so that it's
Mm.
not just adding to my list of to-dos, it's just implemented into things. So concrete example, like when I do my devotions, I'll read the scriptures. Well, I'll be maybe reading through, let's say I'm reading through Genesis. Well, if I'm reading in Genesis chapter 7 that day, I might just open my Hebrew Bible, and I'm not going to read the whole chapter in Hebrew, but I might just read two or three verses in Hebrew. Or same thing for Greek. Like when I prepare sermons, I just finished up a sermon from the book of Acts. Well, I took that passage and actually just worked through it in the Greek, did my own translation. So it's stuff that you're already doing,
Mm.
and you just find these hooks, these ways to connect it to your daily life. One thing we do at home, like for example, my wife and I both speak Spanish, and our daughter's wanting to recover it. And so a lot of times when we're at a meal or we're sitting down together, we'll just switch over to Spanish and just, kick the dust off a little bit and
Mm.
give our Spanish a workout. So basically, any way that you can incorporate the language into stuff you're already doing, it's just gonna give it that much more strength.
Mm. That's super interesting. Yeah, I love all of that. I think different languages are so interesting, just the different perspective that they bring on like it's a different way of thinking, right?
Hmm.
Um it's so amazing, really.
Well, and it'll strengthen your skills in your own language. It's kind of one of those things that goes back to the assumption that we were talking about a minute ago, but we don't think about our mother tongue that much. We don't analyze
Mm.
it. Just because someone speaks a language doesn't mean they can actually teach it, because they've never maybe assessed what they're doing with the
Mm.
language. But when you learn a foreign language, when it's brand new, your brain is comparing and contrasting everything, and it helps you to notice things about your own language that you never noticed before. Or even Spanish, especially French as well. I would find that I'd be reading a word in French and I didn't know what it was, or Spanish, I didn't know what it was, and it was maybe just a basic term, but then when I look it up, I find out that we have a word in English that's from the same root, but it's a really high
Mm,
dollar word in English, but it's just coming from that same Latin root. So it just
mm,
really can enrich even your mother tongue. It's pretty amazing.
mm. That's super interesting. Do you find, I remember being over in Europe for a while and like I could kind of piddle around with French and I would say like a survival level, but my vocabulary is limited, but I can kind of get around. But then you kind of get used, or at least I did, I got used to like not understanding billboards or magazine covers or whatever the case was, just kind of going through life and using what little French I knew, but not reading everything, right? And
Hmm.
then getting back into an English speaking country felt overwhelming initially because I could I could read and comprehend all the billboards again and all the and it was like I couldn't stop reading and it
Right.
felt, does that sound, is that, have you ever experienced something like that? Like, you have so many different experiences in different languages. Have you ever experienced like mental fatigue like that?
It can certainly happen. And maybe this is kind of from the opposite angle, but like I can remember when my wife first and I we first moved to Argentina. We were 21 years old and moved there to start a mission, and we're working with a local church there and a pastor, Argentine pastor that we knew. And our first days there, even weeks, I can remember both of us, we were just like exhausted. Like,
Mm.
why are we so tired? And we were young and healthy, no reason to be tired apparently, but we're just dragging and like can't keep our eyes open. But we realize now that it was because our brains were on overload. I mean, every interaction, every time someone's speaking to you, you're straining to understand everything that they're saying. You're trying to anticipate how am I going to respond to this in a reasonable amount of time. You're thinking, okay, I got to go to the store and buy such and such, so I need to learn the word for that, and then I need to know how to ask, where it is. And so your brain is just constantly running. And I think that that's why, mentally, first of all, that's why it's such a good workout for your brain, but it's also why it is one of the hardest things to do. And I see why people can, I think is a mistake, to live in a country and just kind of huddle up with your language group and kind of live in a little enclave and never break out and never learn the language of the country. And and it happens all the time. It does, and I understand the reasons for it, but I think that's a big one. It's just so hard to push through, but it's that exposure and that kind of survival that you have to do that you mentioned a minute ago. The more places you put yourself where you have to use the language, where you have to deliver it in some way, it's just going to bring it, because your brain, our brains know whether we're serious or not. They know whether they know whether it matters, Like if I read a book, I see a word casually there and I don't know, I might read it and I'm like, oh, I probably won't need to use that. But if it's something that I have to deliver, in a public speech this afternoon in Spanish, I'm going to remember it. So I think that the more times you can put yourself in some type of an environment where a real demand is put on the language,
Mm.
that's where you really get traction.
Hmm. That's good. So let me ask you, following up on that, you always see these studies or whatever that talk about how horrible all of this short form content is for our brains and our focus and our attention span and retention. And I just saw where Apple came out with those new ear pods that do live translation on the spot. I don't know if you
Yeah, I
saw that.
haven't I haven't seen that yet, but I
Yeah.
knew it had to be coming. I
Oh,
mean,
it's wild. They like turn down the person you're talking to a little bit and it's like live translation on the spot. And you know, I see that and it's like, okay, that's amazing. But also, I wonder what detrimental effect that'll have over the long term, just across the board of people not taking the time to work on other languages and think in other perspectives. What are your thoughts on that?
Wow, yeah, so many things to say about that. I think the technology is great. Um, I think we should make the most of technology. We should use technology. I think the problem comes in when we're really being used by technology, when instead of the
Mm,
technology being the tool, we're the tools.
mm,
And I think there is a danger. The designers of these programs, these apps, these technologies, these big companies, they have psychologists working. They know how our brains work. They know how to get us hooked. They know how to get us coming back. And I mean, it sounds very nefarious, and I guess I think it is. I think it's they're looking for any way to connect consumers to their product for monetary gain, and if we're not aware of that, we're really at a disadvantage and I think very vulnerable. But as far as language learning, to kind of get more on a positive side, I think the tools are awesome, but there is the danger of leaning too much on the technology and really not making the effort to communicate. I think there's just something powerful. I can't really scientifically measure this, but there's just something that happens at the human level, at the organic level, when you break into somebody's heart language. It
mm,
really it does something different. I mean, there's a level of affinity, there's a level of connection that happens where you're just one of us now. And
mm,
it just demonstrates love. It demonstrates care and interest in that person and their life and their culture. And so I think that, it would really be a missed opportunity to lean completely on technology. Now, if you can use technology to help you ramp up and get to the next level, the I think it's the I plus one, or wherever you're at, you're just stretching yourself a little bit beyond where you are. I think that that's great. And there's times, obviously, if you're working at the State Department, you're at the UN or something, you're not going to be able to learn all those languages quickly. So the idea of having an in-ear interpreter, I mean, that's great. I think that's powerful. But I look at the way, I'll go to Africa, for example, and so many languages, and I don't have enough time while I'm there to really get fluent in those languages. But if I can just learn a few phrases, a few
mm,
greetings, I just look at the way the crowd will just light up. And
mm,
you address them in their heart language, it just does something for them. And
mm,
so I think technologies. Like I say, we have to be the ones using technology and make sure technology is not using us.
mm. I love that. I love that phrase, heart language. Well, that's what I was going to ask you next. Tell me about uh, what is Vanguard Evangelism? It seems like every time I see you on Facebook, you're racking up airline miles.
Yeah, yeah. I should invest in stock or something.
Yes.
Um, yeah, well, we do travel a lot. Sometimes my wife Christine is able to go with me, and even at times our kids have come along. And then, of course, we lived in Argentina, but yeah, our focus as a ministry really is to share the message of Jesus Christ and to also identify and empower people in the nations that we go to take the gospel, to take the message of Jesus to their own people. And even some of them are even beyond their own people groups, they're cross-cultural missionaries as well. And so that's our heart, that's our passion, and that's what I've dedicated my life to as my principal vocation for over 20 years now.
Mm, that's awesome. Um, Michael, you're such an interesting person. Um, as we wrap up tell me a little bit. I'm going to put a link to your, I know we talked about it for a second, but I'm going to put a link to your podcast in the description. Have you thought about any of your upcoming episodes, some of the church history subjects you might tackle, or can you give us kind of a preview of what's coming?
Wow. Yeah, we've got so many things I want to do. I want to get to interviewing some people as well that are experts in the field. A lot of it has to do with kind of what we'd call public square apologetics types of questions where, for example, people question, is the Bible that we have, you know, how many miles of separation from the original, if any? How reliable is the New Testament? Can we trust those accounts? Some of these questions that people have about Jesus, what I've done, and I'm kind of using this as a strategy to hopefully get people to the content, but I'll just do a Google search and I'll start the question and then I'll see what the top search suggestions are for that question. And when you put in, for example, was Jesus, the number one question was Jesus a real person? And so that was the episode that we did. Our first episode was just on that question: was Jesus a real person? And so seeing ways that we can find out what people are asking, and then
Okay,
go.
Michael, I'm so sorry you froze for the last 30 seconds.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So
What was
the
I saying when I cut
the
off?
evil powers that be
Oh,
wanted
okay.
didn't like what you were saying, so you were frozen. So
Oh, okay.
you said the last thing I heard you say was the public square apologetics,
Oh,
and then
okay.
you froze.
Oh, okay. Well, I can start from there. So our episodes really starting out, we're focusing on public square type questions, apologetics, we might call it, things that people from different backgrounds, different religions or no religion, they're asking about some of these big questions. So concrete example, like the first episode that we did, I answered the question, was Jesus a real person? Now, maybe you
Mm,
and I aren't asking that question, but
mm,
apparently a lot of people are because when I went to Google, I type in what was Jesus and the auto suggestions, those auto suggestions that come up in the search, the number one question about was Jesus, was he a real person? And so we're trying to connect the questions that people are asking with some responses, with some content. So I'm looking to eventually bring in some experts, in different fields, maybe New Testament scholars, Old Testament scholars. A lot of people have questions about, the portrayal of God in the Old Testament and
mm,
how do we make that hold hands or integrate with what we see in the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. So there's just a lot of interesting questions. And then in church history, there's so much, people want to know, hey, why are there so many different types of Christians?
mm,
Or, what are the distinguishing characteristics of these different groups of Christians? How did that all happen? Which one's the right one? Some of these questions that people ask, and even about other religions, other faiths. That's kind of the heartbeat of the podcast is to find out how have other people tried to answer these questions, not just to
mm,
give my perspective as a Christian, but say, okay, how have Hindus, how have Buddhists, how have Muslims answered some of these big questions, and how does that compare to what the teachings of the Bible are, to what the teaching about Jesus Christ is? So, yeah, I think there's plenty of interesting content that I look forward to bringing out to the audience.
mm. That is so good. Is there are there any is there a book or are there any books you would recommend for someone who's maybe asking these questions, or maybe a Christian who's wanting to further study how to answer some of these questions? Is there a resource you would point us to?
Wow. Well, one thing I'd say not to do is don't get your theology and your history from YouTube comments. It's really a
Yeah.
bad, really a bad idea, and it can get pretty decisive. And the trolls are very active. They've already found us. We just started, and
Really? Wow.
yeah, some of the first comments are kind of antagonistic. So that's fine. Hey, that they're watching, they're connecting with it. So. But yeah, as far as books, wow. I mean, it really depends what subject you're interested in. Um, I think that, just some of these apologists, I like William Lane Craig a lot. If you're and he covers a lot of ground. He covers a lot of
Yeah.
topics. He's got a podcast that is very popular level, and so you don't have to. He's a total genius and academic in his writing. I think also that would be very accessible, but his podcast is really bite sized and he
Hmm.
covers a big range of topics. So that could be a place to start, and he would point you to other experts. Podcasts, just even if you know what you're interested in learning about, to search and find podcasts on that topic. That's a place, that you could start. And then from there, you might hear about book recommendations. And if you're really book inclined and kind of like to read, just if you find one book that you like on a topic, just jump into the bibliography and see
Mm.
see what their sources are, and you can kind of go down the rabbit hole just like Alice. You can discover a whole world you never knew was there.
Yeah. Um, that is so good. Um, Let me ask you one more question, Michael, as we close. We started off talking about presuppositions and the big questions. Now that you've lived some life in the United States, in Argentina, and then all of your international travels, um, do you see a lot of commonality in the big questions that people are asking? Or do you see a significant variance in those questions, depending on maybe where somebody grew up?
Yeah, wow, that is a huge, huge question. I think what I have noticed is at the human level, like let's say at the core level, the soul level, I think a lot of those big existential questions that the philosophers have all dealt with, those are the same. Those are, I think, universal. And, from my perspective, they're really a proof that we were born to ask those questions and we were made to find the answers.
Mm.
So that to me ties in with my theology as a Christian, that it is not by accident and that we essentially have as human beings a God-sized hole that only God can fill, and that we have this search. We're born with a search, a disposition to search. So
That
that's
reminds me of that C.S. Lewis quote. I said something like, "If life was meaningless, we wouldn't know that it was meaningless."
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And we know, I think we know that there has to be a purpose. We're not, I think the cows go out there and chew grass and they're not thinking about, oh, what's the meaning of all this? What's my life adding up to? I don't think they ask those questions, but we do. As human beings, we ask those questions incessantly. And so I think on that level, people are all the same, in that sense, in our humanity. Different cultures historically then have come up with different answers, and certain
Mm.
ideas in one place have gotten currency where other ideas have gotten currency on the same questions. And so there's a divergence in terms of how to respond to some of these questions. But the questions, I think, are fundamentally the same. But what I'm seeing now as I travel, and we've talked about young people, we've talked about technology. technology has had this rapid impact on what we all know was happening anyway, globalization. And what
Mm,
you're seeing, I think, is a lot of young people that are saying, you know what, it's our time to have a little slice of the pie. And so the hegemony of the imperial age, the colonial age, all that has collapsed, and people are of different cultures all over the world, different language groups all over the world. They're saying, hey, we want to be players in this game. We want to be on the field. We don't want to be spectators. And so there's rising nationalism, which I don't think is all bad. Certainly in extremes, it can be bad. Anything in an extreme can be bad. But I think there's a sense of pride in culture and in heritage that is rising, and just a questioning of the status quo geopolitically, culturally, that maybe we've not seen. You know, I don't think we've ever seen it at this level in human history. So it's an exciting time. It's an exciting time. And I think the opportunity for Christians, let's say Western Christians, is to really have a posture of humility and go to listen as much as to
mm,
speak, go to learn as much as to teach. And we're sharing, we've the Western countries have been very focused on missions, Christian missions, which is good. But I think now it's a new time to really see how the Holy Spirit is working in in so many places, and from so many places. And so
mm,
it's a beautiful time to live. It's an amazing time.
mm. That's good. Michael, thank you so much for your time. I look forward to reading your St. Patrick book, and I look forward to listening to your podcast.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you.